Today, there are over 8 billion people on Earth, half of them men, fathers, brothers, sons. It feels normal to think it's always been this way, that there have always been equal numbers of us walking side by side, but if you looked back 7,000 years, the picture would be unrecognizable. Something happened then, something that left almost every male lineage on the planet wiped out. Not just a war or a famine or a plague, but a collapse so deep that the genetic record still remembers it. Scientists call it the Y chromosome bottleneck, a time when up to 90% of men disappeared from the story of humanity, not vanished from the earth entirely, but erased from ancestry, their bloodlines ending in silence while a few survivors carried their names forward. It's as if entire generations of fathers were deleted while mothers and children went on living. And the strangest part is, it didn't happen once in some remote corner of the world, it happened everywhere. Across continents, across cultures, across time. This was not the extinction of humans, it was the extinction of men, a genetic echo of a world consumed by rivalry, conquest, and power. The war that killed nearly every man on Earth wasn't fought with bombs or machines. It was fought with inheritance, clan loyalty, and blades of bronze, and its consequences still live inside every cell of your body right now. If you're watching this before bed, or maybe on the bus, remember this. Your entire existence may come from one of the few men who survived that ancient war. One survivor among millions lost. So subscribe, and let's go back to the moment when the world almost erased half of itself. Every city hums with life, streets glow at night, voices, machines, and heartbeat rhythms fill the planet. But once, not so long ago in the scale of time, there was a moment when almost every man vanished. Not metaphorically, literally. The world that would one day be filled with fathers, sons, and grandfathers came terrifyingly close to having none. The evidence is not written in ruins or carved into stone. It is inside us, hidden in our DNA. When scientists first mapped the human genome, they expected to find the messy, tangled record of billions of ancestors. But buried inside the Y chromosome, the strand of DNA that passes from father to son, they found something strange. It looked like an echo, a quiet moment in prehistory, when the number of men crashed so completely that the genetic record almost flatlined. The numbers are shocking. Around 7,000 years ago, during the Neolithic period, almost every male lineage on Earth disappeared. Billions of potential family lines erased in a single evolutionary blink. Yet women's genetic diversity stayed wide and healthy. Humanity survived, but the fathers of that world did not. Imagine that for a moment. Whole villages, where only a handful of men remained. Children who would never meet uncles, cousins, or grandfathers because their lines had ended, generations reduced to whispers in the genome. It sounds like science fiction, a war so vast it left fingerprints in our DNA. But this isn't myth. This happened. And the story of how it happened begins with a question that has haunted scientists for years. How can you wipe out nearly every man on Earth without wiping out the species? The answer doesn't lie in one battlefield or one disaster. It lies in the way humans began to live together. When farming replaced hunting, something fundamental changed. Villages grew, families settled, and property became inheritance. Men began to fight not for survival, but for control, for land, for resources, for power. Over generations, those fights grew into something else entirely. Wars between clans, raids between families, victories that meant one bloodline thrived while 100 others vanished forever. The Y chromosome kept score. Every man alive today carries the genetic legacy of the few who survived that silent war. Just a handful of fathers whose descendants repopulated the earth. The rest are gone, erased by time, violence, or both. It's hard to imagine now, in a world of skyscrapers and satellites, that humanity once balanced on the edge of losing half of itself. Yet the story written in our DNA says it happened and it changed us. It shaped how we organize, how we fight, how we build families. It explains why power and survival have been tied to men for so long. And it warns us of what happens when competition replaces cooperation, when brother turns on brother until there are almost none left. This was the war that killed nearly every man on Earth. The story began not in a battlefield or a ruined city, but in a quiet laboratory. Scientists were looking at DNA, tracing the patterns of inheritance that connect every human being on Earth. They weren't expecting to find a mystery. They were trying to build a family tree of humanity, linking branches that reached back tens of thousands of years. But when they followed the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed from father to son, they saw something that made no sense. The tree wasn't branching, it was collapsing. Instead of a wide network of fathers, uncles, and sons spreading through time, the Y chromosome map looked like a handful of surviving lines surrounded by emptiness. It was as if almost every man who had ever lived at that time had suddenly vanished from the record. No slow decline, no gradual shift, just a cliff, a genetic freefall. At first, researchers thought it was a mistake. Maybe the data was incomplete. Maybe they were missing samples. But as more genomes were added from across the world, the pattern held. Around 7,000 years ago, the diversity of the Y chromosome dropped by more than 90%. It was like looking at a world where all but a few fathers had disappeared, leaving only their sons to carry humanity forward. What made it stranger was that women's DNA didn't show the same collapse. The genetic record of mothers, passed through mitochondrial DNA, stayed broad and stable. The female population was thriving while the male line was being erased. Something massive had happened to the men, something that didn't affect women the same way. To the geneticists, it looked like a bottleneck, a point in history where only a small number of males passed on their genes. But this wasn't a famine or a disease that killed indiscriminately. This was selective, targeted. For every 100 women who had children, maybe only one man did. That ratio leaves a signature in DNA that never fades. The entire male gene pool shrinks, while the female side remains healthy and diverse. The evidence was everywhere, written in every living man's Y chromosome. It was as if human history had been rewritten by a few dominant lineages, while countless others were lost. Scientists began to call it the neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck. But that sterile name hides how terrifying it really was. It meant there was a time when the male half of humanity nearly ended, not because of a single catastrophe, but because of how society itself had changed. Farming, settlement, and inheritance created a world where only a few men controlled power and reproduction. The rest were left behind, their lines fading in silence. Every modern man alive today descends from that narrow group. Our fathers' fathers' fathers were the survivors of a genetic purge so extreme it reshaped the human genome forever. The clue was there all along, hidden inside us, waiting for someone to notice that nearly every man on Earth shares a secret born from a war we never knew happened. It started with a team of scientists who weren't looking for a war at all. They were geneticists, quiet explorers of data instead of deserts, people who spent their lives reading the code written inside every cell. Among them was a group studying human evolution using new computational models that could simulate how populations change over thousands of years. They wanted to understand why some genetic lines thrive while others vanish. But when they looked at the Y chromosome data, the numbers refused to make sense. It was as if history had hidden a disaster too big to ignore. In one paper after another, the pattern appeared the same. Around 7,000 years ago, the effective male population, meaning the number of men who actually passed on their genes, crashed to nearly zero. Not literally zero. There were still men alive. But in genetic terms, it was as if almost every male lineage had been erased from existence. The models didn't lie. They kept producing the same terrifying result. Across continents, cultures, and climates, male diversity dropped by more than 90%. Meanwhile, the effective female population stayed constant. Women's lineages continued uninterrupted. Something selective had happened to men alone. The scientists began calling it the Ghost War because no trace of it appeared in written records or clear archaeological layers. It existed only in the genome, like the echo of a battle fought and forgotten. One researcher explained it like this: if you met 1,000 men alive 7,000 years ago and looked at their Y chromosomes, almost all of those lines would be gone today. Only a few would remain. The rest would end without descendants. In genetic terms, that's what almost every man really means. Not that they were all dead, but that their bloodlines ended before they could reach us. Their genes left no trace in the present. The team ran every possible explanation. Could it have been a disease that targeted men? A natural disaster that somehow spared women? Nothing fit the pattern as perfectly as one conclusion. Society itself had changed in a way that eliminated most male lines. The rise of clans, inheritance, and organized warfare created small groups of dominant men whose sons inherited both power and reproductive access. Losing a clan in battle didn't just mean losing lives. It meant erasing a lineage from history. The numbers matched the model exactly. A world of warring patriarchal groups could cut male diversity to a fraction in just a few centuries. One researcher described it as evolution through conquest. Another called it the most efficient genocide imaginable, though it was never planned. Just the natural result of a world where victory decided who had children and who didn't. The Ghost War left no swords or ruins behind, but its fingerprints remain inside every living man. A genetic scar stretching back 7,000 years, discovered by scientists who never expected to find a battlefield in the code of life itself. When scientists talk about a population bottleneck, they don't mean every person vanished at once. They mean that the genetic variety of a species narrowed so sharply that most lineages disappeared forever. Imagine a river splitting into thousands of small streams, then forcing all that water through a single narrow pipe before spreading out again. The water keeps flowing, but almost all the separate paths are gone. That's what happened to humanity's Y chromosome about 7,000 years ago. On the surface, people might have looked fine. Villages were growing, farms expanding, new tools appearing. But inside the DNA, something dramatic was happening. The genetic record of fathers was shrinking fast. This is where scientists make an important distinction. There's a difference between how many men were alive at the time and how many actually passed on their genes. The first number is called the census population. The second is called the effective population. In theory, there could have been millions of men living during the Neolithic era, but only a few thousand of them might have had sons whose lines continued. From a genetic perspective, the rest didn't matter. Their family trees ended. What makes this even stranger is that the same pattern doesn't show up in women. The mitochondrial DNA that passes from mother to child stayed broad and healthy. The female population didn't crash. This means the bottleneck wasn't caused by famine or disease that affected everyone equally. It was something that targeted men specifically. Some scientists believe this was the result of power concentrating into fewer hands. As society shifted from small groups of equals to hierarchical clans, some men gained control over land, herds, and resources. Those men had many wives and many children, while others had none. Generation after generation, the genes of the powerful multiplied while everyone else's disappeared. The math is brutal but simple. If one man fathers 10 children and 9 others father none, within a few generations his lineage dominates the population. Even without large-scale killing, the effect is the same as wiping out the rest. Other researchers think direct violence played a major role. In a world of tribal warfare, entire groups of men could be wiped out while the women were absorbed into victorious clans. Their children would carry the mother's genetic diversity, but only the father's limited Y chromosomes. Over centuries, this process carved a deep asymmetry into our DNA, one that still shows today. Almost all modern men descend from a handful of male ancestors who lived during that narrow period of time. Meanwhile, the female genetic tree stretches much wider and deeper, connecting to thousands of ancestral mothers. The bottleneck wasn't just a moment of loss. It was a turning point in how power and survival intertwined. It created a world where dominance, inheritance, and reproduction fused into one. And in doing so, it permanently rewrote the balance between men and women at the genetic level, a hidden legacy of inequality that still whispers through every Y chromosome on Earth. 7,000 years ago, the world looked nothing like it does today, yet it was already starting to hum with the first signs of civilization. Across the plains of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, farming villages were spreading like stars across a dark landscape. Smoke rose from clay ovens, stone tools gleamed from daily use. For the first time in human history, people were staying in one place long enough to call it home. They planted grain in neat rows, herded goats and cattle, and built storage pits to guard their harvests through winter. What had once been a life of wandering and hunting was transforming into one of planning and ownership. And with ownership came something new and dangerous, the idea of mine. For thousands of generations before this, land could not truly belong to anyone. But once humans began to farm, soil turned into territory, fences appeared, boundaries mattered. And when boundaries mattered, conflict followed. The Neolithic world was not a peaceful Eden of simple farmers. It was a landscape of growing tension, small communities pushing against each other as they competed for rivers, fertile land, and herds. Copper had just begun to shimmer in the hands of toolmakers. It was rare and valuable, one of the first metals humans learned to shape. With copper tools came sharper blades and stronger weapons, symbols of status and power. Trade routes began to form between distant villages, carrying obsidian, salt, shells, and stories. For the first time, wealth could travel, and with it came envy. Archaeologists find signs of this change everywhere. Defensive walls rising around settlements, arrowheads embedded in skeletons. Entire villages burned to ash. This was a world learning how to fight on a new scale. Before farming, conflict might have meant a quick raid, a stolen hunt, or a single fatal clash. But when food, land, and inheritance entered the picture, war became organized. People fought not just for survival, but for dominance. And dominance meant the right to pass your bloodline into the next generation. In some valleys, rich soil created powerful families who controlled irrigation and trade. In others, herders roamed with vast flocks, measuring their wealth in animals instead of crops. These herding societies were mobile, armed, and fiercely protective. When they clashed with farmers, the results could be devastating. Over time, certain men began to rise above others, not because of strength alone, but because they could control resources, lead warriors, and negotiate alliances. They were the first chiefs, the early architects of hierarchy. The Neolithic world was alive with innovation and fear, a time of progress shadowed by growing inequality. The tools that fed villages also forged weapons. The walls that kept danger out became symbols of control. Humanity had entered a new chapter where survival was no longer enough. People wanted power, legacy, and permanence. And in chasing those things, they unknowingly set the stage for a genetic war that would erase nearly every male line on Earth. As the Neolithic world grew richer, the structure of society began to change in quiet but powerful ways. Farming had already tied families to the land, but herding added something even more transformative. Cattle became wealth. Herds were living treasure, portable banks of food, labor, and status. The more animals a man owned, the more powerful his family became. And because animals could be stolen, every herd needed protection. That protection came from kinship, from brothers, cousins, and fathers who stood together. Over time, blood became currency, and men became the keepers of it. This is how patrilineal clans were born. In a patrilineal world, identity flowed through the male line. A child took the father's name, inherited the father's land, and defended the father's herd. Women married into other clans, creating bonds between families, but never owning the wealth they helped sustain. This system concentrated property and power in the hands of men. It also made violence efficient. When one clan raided another, they weren't just stealing cattle. They were erasing rivals, breaking bloodlines, and expanding their influence. A single successful raid could mean more livestock, more land, and more wives, all feeding the same cycle of dominance. Bride wealth turned these arrangements into rules. Marriage was no longer just about love or companionship. It was a transaction, sealed with gifts of cattle or grain. The exchange of wealth between families made alliances stronger, but it also made women into symbols of economic power. The right to marry and reproduce was no longer equally shared among men. Only those with herds and wealth could afford wives. The rest were left on the margins, their names and genes fading with each generation. Anthropologists can still see echoes of this system in the DNA record. A few male lineages dominate vast populations, while countless others vanish. This imbalance didn't happen overnight. It was built over centuries of herding, trading, and raiding as men who controlled animals gained control over people. Raiding became an institution. Young men trained together, fought together, and died together, defending or stealing the resources that defined their clan's survival. Over time, this loyalty turned into identity. A man's value was measured not by who he was, but by which bloodline he belonged to and how well he protected it. The clan replaced the individual. Survival was no longer about personal skill or bravery, but about maintaining the strength of the group and the purity of its line. Those outside the clan's protection had no future. They couldn't marry, couldn't inherit, couldn't pass their names on, their genes disappeared silently while the victors multiplied. What began as simple herding had become a self-reinforcing machine of control. Power, wealth, and reproduction all revolved around the same few men, and through that system, humanity unknowingly walked straight into a genetic bottleneck, a point in history when a handful of fathers would shape the DNA of nearly every man alive today. Across the ancient plains, a new kind of army began to form, one not built on nations or kings, but on blood. Brothers, cousins, and fathers stood side by side, fighting for the same land, the same herd, the same name. These were the Brotherhood armies, born from the rise of clans and the logic of inheritance. When wealth flowed through the male line, so did violence. Defending one's kin became the highest duty, and losing a battle didn't just mean death, it meant extinction. When a clan fell, its men were often wiped out completely. Their homes were burned, their herds taken, and their wives and children absorbed into the victors' families. In one brutal stroke, an entire Y chromosome lineage vanished. The conquerors didn't need to destroy cities to erase their enemies. They only needed to destroy the men. The rest of the population would be folded into their bloodline, carrying forward the genetic signature of the winners. Archaeologists find hints of this in mass graves from Europe and Asia, where dozens of young men lie buried together, their bodies showing identical wounds from close combat. These were not random skirmishes. They were systematic purges, whole groups of related males eliminated at once, and every time it happened, the genetic tree of humanity lost another branch. But to the people living through it, this wasn't seen as tragedy. It was destiny. From boyhood, young men were raised to fight for their kin. They trained together, hunted together, and swore loyalty to the same patriarch. Their unity made them powerful. A band of warriors bound by blood could move and fight as one, protecting the resources that kept their families alive. In return, victory meant reward. Survivors gained status, land, and wives taken from the defeated clans. The system was simple and devastating. Each generation, only a fraction of men reproduced, and they were almost always the victors. Over time, this pattern compressed the entire male gene pool into a handful of surviving lines. From a genetic perspective, war acted like a filter, letting only certain Y chromosomes through, while countless others were lost forever. This is why scientists see such sharp bottlenecks in male DNA during this era. The wars weren't just about territory, they were about legacy. Every battle decided whose descendants would populate the future and whose would vanish. The Brotherhood armies turned survival into a competition written in blood. The longer a clan stayed dominant, the more its genes spread until a few lineages stretched across continents. When you look at the genetic map of modern humans, you can still trace those ancient victories. A few powerful male ancestors responsible for millions of living descendants, their triumphs encoded in every cell. Behind the glory and loyalty, behind the rituals of courage and honor, the Brotherhood armies were machines of genetic replacement. They didn't just win wars, they rewrote humanity's DNA, one lost lineage at a time. Imagine a world where your last name could vanish overnight, not because you died, but because your entire lineage was erased in a single raid. That was the reality of life between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, when the struggle between clans determined not only who lived and who died, but who would exist in the future at all. To understand how this worked, scientists created models of population genetics, and the math tells a chilling story. When male kin groups fought, the losses were absolute. Defeat meant extinction. Every man in the losing clan might be killed or driven off, leaving no sons to carry on the family line. The women, however, were often spared. They were absorbed into the victors' households, married into the winning clan, and had children who carried their mother's genes, but their father's Y chromosomes. Over time, this cycle repeated again and again, and with each generation, the pool of male lineages shrank while the diversity of female ancestry stayed wide. Even if thousands of people survived, their DNA told a story of collapse on one side and continuity on the other. In simple terms, the female lines flowed freely between groups, weaving connections across entire regions, while the male lines hit dead ends. The genetic map of early humanity became patchwork, a mosaic of maternal variety anchored to just a few dominant paternal branches. Scientists call this kind of shift a bias in gene flow. But for the people living through it, it was life as usual. Every young man who went to battle risked not only his life, but his entire bloodline. Every victory his clan won secured not just land or livestock, but the right for his Y chromosome to survive another generation. The men who lost vanished completely from history, their surnames erased before they could even be spoken by grandchildren. From the outside, it might have looked like humanity was thriving. Villages were growing, crops were plentiful, populations were expanding, but inside the genome, something was being hollowed out. The male tree of life was being pruned with ruthless precision. It didn't take long. In as little as 20 generations, the math shows, repeated cycles of clan warfare could wipe out 90% of male genetic lines. That's barely 500 years. In the space of recorded memory, an entire world of fathers could disappear. And yet, through the women who bridged these clans, humanity itself survived. Their migrations, marriages, and children became the threads that tied the species together when everything else was fracturing. Every man alive today is descended from those who won the ancient battles, but also from the women who crossed the lines after them, carrying life from one side to another. The surname may vanish, the clan may fall, but humanity endures through the quiet resilience written in the genetic code of mothers who outlasted the wars that nearly erased their sons. If you dig deep enough into the soil of the ancient world, you find the scars of what really happened. Beneath quiet farmlands and modern towns, lie the burn layers, thin black lines of ash that mark the moments when everything changed. Archaeologists read them like the pages of a book written in fire. In one site after another, from Europe to Central Asia, the same story appears. Settlements ringed with palisades, skeletons with crushed skulls, arrowheads still lodged in bone. These are not traces of random violence. They are evidence of organized destruction. In southern Germany, a site called Talheim revealed a mass grave containing the remains of more than 30 people, men, women, and children. Most were struck from behind, some still carrying stone tools or ornaments from their daily lives. The attackers were likely neighbours, another farming group competing for land or water. In northern France, another site, called Achenheim, tells a similar story, with a settlement burned to the ground and the charred bones of its inhabitants buried beneath the rubble. Each layer of soil preserves the same haunting signature, violence repeating across centuries. These discoveries line up perfectly with the genetic evidence. The periods of widespread destruction match the timeline of the Y chromosome bottleneck. Every time a village was wiped out, so were its male lineages. The survivors, mostly women and children, were taken in by the victors. Their DNA merged into the new population, carrying maternal diversity forward, but eliminating the losing clan's paternal signature. From a distance of thousands of years, you can still see the pattern written in the earth. Walls were built not for show, but for desperation. Early farmers and herders lived in constant fear of raids. Their wooden fences and ditches were crude but symbolic, the first attempts at fortifications. Some villages expanded them into full defensive systems with gates and watchtowers. These early strongholds mark a shift in human psychology, a world where danger came not from nature but from other humans. The weapons evolved too. Stone blades became polished axes and flint-tipped arrows. Later, copper replaced stone, giving rise to sharper edges and deadlier strikes. The more advanced the tools became, the more final the destruction. Archaeologists find entire communities reduced to ash, with valuables still buried in the wreckage, proof that the inhabitants never returned. This is how war looked before written history, not glorious battles but sudden violence that erased entire generations. Each burned village meant another collapse in male ancestry. Every pile of bones beneath the earth marks a lost surname, a vanished bloodline. The walls, the weapons, the burn layers, they are the visible echoes of an invisible war that reshaped humanity's future. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were part of a global pattern, a quiet apocalypse repeated from one valley to the next. And when the fires went out, the victors rebuilt on the ashes, never realizing that the true record of their survival would be written not in stone, but in the DNA of every descendant who came after. Long before history was written, the survivors of those ancient wars began to tell stories. Around campfires, in caves, and later in temples, people passed down tales of gods and heroes, of floods that wiped the earth clean, of brothers who turned against each other. To modern ears, they sound like myths, but to scientists and historians, they might be the echoes of a time when men really did destroy their own kind on a massive scale. Myths survive because they carry truth, wrapped in symbol. The great flood stories told in Mesopotamia, India, and across the Mediterranean all describe a world reset, where almost everyone perishes and a small remnant rebuilds. Maybe it wasn't water that drowned them, but war. Maybe those floods were memories of the waves of destruction that swept through villages during the Neolithic age. Entire generations of men gone, their names washed away, while a few survivors began again. The myths of divine weapons also take on new meaning. The thunderbolts of Zeus, the fiery arrows of Apollo, and the sky weapons of the Vedic gods may have been inspired by the first use of metal blades and projectiles. To people who had only known stone and wood, the shine of copper and bronze must have looked like magic. The sky gods weren't just creators, they were destroyers, reflections of a new kind of power humanity had unleashed upon itself. Then there are the stories of brother against brother, from Cain and Abel to Romulus and Remus, from the Mahabharata's family war to the Norse sagas of kin fighting kin at the end of days. These aren't coincidences. They are cultural memories of a world where loyalty to blood could both save and doom you. In a society built on clans and inheritance, the line between family and enemy was dangerously thin. Every ancient culture kept those memories alive, reshaping them into legend so the lessons would never fade. The pattern repeats across continents, a golden age of peace shattered by betrayal, a god who punishes humanity for its violence, a hero who must rebuild a broken world. These stories trace back to a real psychological wound left by centuries of conflict, a collective trauma written not in language but in ritual and song. Even today, these myths linger in how we think about power and war. We still talk about cleansing floods, chosen survivors, and weapons from the sky. We still glorify the brotherhood of warriors while mourning the cost. Beneath the poetry, the message is the same one whispered by DNA. There was a time when men fought each other so completely that most of their lines ended forever. Myths are how we remembered that without remembering it consciously, they turned loss into meaning, tragedy into warning. The legends that shaped civilization may have started as something else, a way to make sense of the darkest chapter in human evolution, the war that almost erased the fathers of the world. Walk through an ancient burial site, and you can almost hear the silence of missing voices. The bones are still there, arranged in careful rows or scattered in forgotten graves. But when scientists extract DNA from those remains, the pattern is unmistakable. Entire branches of humanity simply stop. Whole genetic lines end in the dirt, never to appear again. Archaeologists call them cultural layers. Geneticists call them haplogroups. Together, they tell a story about how a few men came to father nearly everyone alive today, while countless others vanished from the record. In Central Asia, the Y chromosomes of men from around 5,000 years ago tell a story of dominance. Almost all belong to a single lineage, a genetic stamp that spread across thousands of miles in just a few centuries. Before that, there had been dozens of separate male lines, each belonging to small tribes or clans. After the bottleneck, only one remains. It is as if a single victorious group swept across the landscape, replacing the fathers of every region they entered. Their sons carried that same Y chromosome, spreading it further with each generation until the map of human ancestry was redrawn by conquest. The same pattern appears in Europe. Ancient DNA shows a dramatic shift around the time of the Bronze Age. Before the rise of metal tools, men carried a variety of Y haplogroups, reflecting a patchwork of local communities. Then, suddenly, that diversity collapsed. One lineage, associated with steppe herders from the east, explodes across the continent. Within a few hundred years, nearly all European males descend from this narrow band of ancestors. The old lines are gone, their traces remain only in graves, their stones marking the end of bloodlines that had survived for millennia. Similar patterns appear in East Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Everywhere scientists look, the same story unfolds. A few dominant male lineages spread rapidly, while others disappear. Women's DNA, by contrast, stays remarkably diverse. This shows that the population itself didn't collapse. It was the men who did. Archaeologists can even match these genetic shifts to evidence of cultural change. The arrival of new pottery styles, new weapons, and new burial customs aligns with the replacement of local male lines. When one group conquered another, they didn't just take land. They absorbed the women and children, ensuring their Y chromosome became the foundation of future generations. The cemeteries show the aftermath. Rows of graves where women and children share genetic ties with newcomers, while the original men are nowhere to be found. Every missing lineage is an empty chair in the human family. a reminder that evolution doesn't always happen slowly. Sometimes it happens violently, with entire branches pruned from the tree of life in the span of a few lifetimes. Today, when geneticists trace our ancestry, they find only a handful of men standing at the roots of billions. Each one represents not just survival, but dominance, the genetic echo of ancient victories that filled the world with descendants while leaving countless other chairs forever empty. When scientists first discovered the massive collapse of male genetic diversity, not everyone agreed that war alone could explain it. Some researchers wondered if something else had joined the fight, something invisible. What if disease had done what weapons could not? It sounds strange, but the evidence suggests the bottleneck may have been caused by both violence and biology working together. Imagine a world where early villages were growing, people living close together for the first time, surrounded by livestock. That new way of life brought food and stability, but it also brought germs. Bacteria and viruses that had once been harmless in animals began to jump into humans. Crowded homes and poor sanitation made it easy for infections to spread, and sometimes those infections hit men harder than women. Even today, certain diseases affect men more severely because of differences in hormones, immunity, and behavior. Testosterone can suppress parts of the immune system, while estrogen boosts it. Men were also more likely to be exposed to new pathogens through hunting, raiding, or trading. If an epidemic targeted males just slightly more than females, generation after generation, it could magnify the genetic imbalance we see in the record. Archaeological evidence shows waves of population turnover that don't always line up with signs of warfare. In some regions, entire male lines vanish without widespread destruction. That's what led some scientists to suspect a plague. But others argue that disease alone couldn't explain how a few surviving Y chromosomes spread so far and fast. For that to happen, social structure must have played a role. When societies became organized around clans and herds, power concentrated in a few male leaders. Their sons inherited both status and reproductive rights. If a disease wiped out rival groups or weakened communities, those leaders could step in to claim territory and women, rapidly spreading their lineage. In that way, pathogens and patriarchy could have worked hand in hand. A plague might open the door, and warfare would walk through it. Once a clan rose to dominance, war and inheritance ensured that its Y chromosome spread across vast regions. Over a few hundred years, the combined effects of sickness and conquest could erase nearly every competing male line. The world that emerged would have looked stronger on the surface. Populations recovered. Villages expanded again. But under the skin, genetic diversity had been stripped away. The survivors were not the luckiest, just the last ones standing after both sword and sickness had done their work. The question of which force mattered more, war or plague, may never have a final answer. The truth could be that both shaped humanity together. Disease weakened, war finished, and reproduction decided who would rebuild. When scientists look at our DNA today, they see the fingerprints of both. The scars of violence carved into the Y chromosome and the quiet signature of ancient epidemics that favored survival through adaptation. Two killers, one outcome, and a future forever changed by the partnership between biology and blood. When scientists tried to understand how quickly male lineages vanished during the Neolithic period, they turned to computers. By creating digital models of ancient societies, they could watch centuries of evolution unfold in minutes. These simulations, known as agent-based models, treat every person as an individual within a virtual world. Each man and woman follows simple rules about birth, death, and reproduction. When those rules include patrilineal warfare and unequal marriage patterns, the results are shocking. Within just a few hundred years, the diversity of Y chromosomes drops to almost nothing. In some simulations, the population of men looks healthy in numbers, but nearly all of them carry the same genetic signature. It is a silent collapse, a world that appears full but is genetically empty. The model begins with hundreds of small clans, each ruled by a few powerful men. These clans compete for resources and survival. When one clan wins a conflict, it absorbs the defeated group's women and children, but kills or banishes the men. Those who remain pass on the victor's Y chromosome. Generation after generation, this system repeats. Even if only 1 in 10 clans triumphs consistently, their genetic lines spread rapidly, while all others fade. After just 20 generations, the number of surviving male lineages falls by more than 90%. The same outcome appears, no matter how the model starts. As long as power and reproduction are concentrated in the hands of a few elite males, genetic diversity plummets. What makes the results even more striking is how fast the collapse happens. In evolutionary terms, a few centuries are nothing, but in that brief span, the genetic record can be rewritten completely. The key lies in polygyny, the practice where dominant men have multiple wives, while others have none. In the simulations, even small differences in reproductive success multiply dramatically over time. A man with 4 wives can produce 10 times as many descendants as a man with none. His sons inherit his advantage, and soon his Y chromosome dominates the population. When combined with the violence of interclan warfare, the effect becomes irreversible. Losing one battle means losing an entire lineage, while winning ensures your DNA floods the next generation. The computer models mirror what the genetic evidence already shows. Humanity went through a period where power was both inherited and defended by force, creating a world shaped by the few and carried by their sons. These findings help explain why modern humans share so little variation in the Y chromosome compared to the rest of our DNA. It wasn't random chance. It was a process that turned society itself into a genetic weapon. What began as competition for resources became a self-reinforcing system that trimmed the male population to a razor's edge. By the time the world entered the Bronze Age, most of the damage had already been done. The simulations reveal the brutal logic of survival in those early civilizations. The war for dominance wasn't just fought with weapons. It was fought with inheritance, and every generation became another turn of the blade that carved our ancestry down to a few surviving names. By the time the fires of the Neolithic wars burned out, the world that remained was ruled by a few surviving bloodlines. What the simulations predicted, history confirmed. Genetic studies show that vast regions of the world today can trace their male ancestry back to only a handful of men who lived thousands of years ago. This is called the founder effect, when one small group of ancestors becomes the source of an entire population. It's as if the story of humanity reset itself around a few victorious lineages, their names lost, but their chromosomes immortal. In parts of Asia, nearly 1 in 6 men share the same Y chromosome that traces back to a single ancestor who lived less than 1,000 years ago. In Europe and the Middle East, similar patterns stretch back even further to the Bronze Age and before. These are the genetic fingerprints of the few who survived the bottleneck and built empires on its ashes. The rise of the few didn't happen by accident. It was the outcome of power crystallizing around families that combined warfare, wealth, and faith into systems of control. A victorious clan could spread its influence across continents through conquest and marriage. Every new generation expanded their reach, not just politically but genetically. When one family dominated an entire culture, their Y chromosome became its invisible signature, carried forward by millions who would never know its origin. Archaeologists see the evidence of this transition in settlement patterns. Small farming villages gave way to fortified cities ruled by dynasties. Trade routes connected regions that had once been isolated. Metal weapons, horse breeding, and long-distance alliances allowed these new elites to project their power far beyond their own lands. Each victory meant new wives, new offspring, and new expansions of their genetic footprint. In just a few centuries, their lineage could replace hundreds of others. The math of inheritance made it unstoppable. While most men had few or no children, the elite produced dozens. Their sons inherited their father's status and repeated the cycle, spreading their Y chromosomes like seeds carried by the wind. Even when kingdoms fell, the genes of the rulers endured through their descendants among the conquered. Modern geneticists have found that this pattern is global. From the Mongolian steppe to West Africa, from the Mediterranean coast to the islands of the Pacific, humanity bears the marks of founders who rose during this violent reshaping of society. Each one represents a moment when history narrowed to a single surviving thread. The diversity that had once defined humanity's early years was replaced by a few powerful strains that would dominate for millennia. The rise of the few left a strange legacy. It made us more connected than ever before, but also more uniform. The men who triumphed in that distant era still speak through our DNA. Their victories became our inheritance, and their dominance still echoes in the chromosomes of billions of people who walk the earth today, carrying the legacy of the few who refused to be erased. Through all the chaos of ancient wars and collapsing lineages, one side of humanity held everything together. While men fought and vanished, women became the bridge that carried life across generations. Their DNA tells a story of endurance and quiet strength. When the Y chromosomes of men were disappearing, the mitochondrial lines of women stayed rich and varied. This wasn't luck. It was the result of connection, of choices that valued survival over conquest. In a world defined by clan warfare, women were the ones who crossed the lines. Through marriage, trade, or capture, they moved between tribes, weaving networks of kinship that linked enemies and allies alike. Each new union tied one community to another, keeping human populations genetically healthy, even when violence tried to tear them apart. While men built walls and fought over boundaries, women carried the future in their bodies, ensuring that no single disaster could erase humanity completely. Their migrations created a web of relationships that spread information, technology, and language across vast regions. Every birth became an act of rebuilding. Archaeologists can see this in the record. Even when entire male populations vanish from a site, the continuity of female ancestry remains. The pottery styles, food traditions, and home structures stay consistent, suggesting that while leaders and warriors changed, the women preserved the heart of daily life. They kept agriculture alive, tended children, healed the wounded, and passed down the stories that made survival meaningful. In that way, women became the living memory of human culture. When a clan lost its men to war, it was often the women who negotiated peace, who adopted orphaned children, who kept the fields planted and the fires burning. Their caregiving was not just emotional but civilizational. Without it, the species might have fractured beyond repair. Even genetic studies confirm this invisible network. While the Y chromosome tree shrank to a few dominant branches, mitochondrial DNA stayed vibrant and widespread. The female genome became a record of continuity that the male genome could not match. It carried the signatures of migration, cooperation, and exchange. In this sense, women were the true architects of human resilience. They transformed survival into connection, loss into renewal. Every time a village was destroyed, they rebuilt the bonds that war had broken. Their strength was not measured in conquest but in persistence. Even today, scientists can trace their unbroken lines through time. From Neolithic villages to modern cities, a lattice of life that never gave way. When we look at the genetic scars of the bottleneck, it's easy to see a world ruled by violence and male ambition. But behind that story is another one, quieter but just as powerful. The women who refused to let humanity collapse, who kept the songs, the skills, and the stories alive until peace returned. Their lines did not break, and because of them, we are still here. When humans first gathered into cities, the world changed forever. The small farming villages that had once dotted the landscape began to merge into something larger, more complex, and far more unequal. The rise of agriculture had already created surplus food, but now that surplus needed to be controlled. Grain could be stored, counted, and taxed, and whoever controlled the storehouses controlled the people. What began as a way to feed communities during bad seasons turned into a system of power that would define civilization. The same men who had once led clans in battle now ruled cities through bureaucracy. Victory on the battlefield became inheritance in the palace. In places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, early kings emerged as both warlords and administrators. They built temples and granaries side by side, using religion to justify their rule. The gods, they claimed, had chosen them to keep order. The people who worked the fields or baked the bread were now part of a hierarchy that reached all the way to heaven. Every sack of grain, every drop of water from the irrigation canals, became part of an economic network that reinforced male dominance. The clan system that had once revolved around kinship evolved into dynasties that revolved around inheritance. Bloodlines were no longer just about family pride. They became the legal foundation of power. Sons inherited not just land or herds, but entire states. Marriage turned into a political tool, uniting kingdoms and securing alliances. Daughters were exchanged between elites to keep the system stable, but rarely allowed to rule. The old logic of patrilineal control, born in the fields and pastures of the Neolithic age, had found its ultimate expression in kingship. Archaeological records show this transformation in physical form. Ziggurats, pyramids, and massive temples rose above the plains, each one a monument to hierarchy. Inside, scribes kept meticulous records of harvests and taxes, the first written documents in human history. Writing itself was invented not to tell stories, but to track debt and ownership. The pen became another weapon of control. The gods these new rulers served were often modelled after themselves, male deities of war, order, and fertility. The Divine Father replaced the clan patriarch. Obedience became a virtue, rebellion a sin. This merging of economy, religion, and authority ensured that male power was no longer just physical, it was institutional. It could survive even when the man himself died, passed down like property from one generation to the next. Cities made power permanent. What had once been won by spears and raids was now preserved through ledgers and laws. The bottleneck of Y chromosomes became the blueprint of civilization itself, a hierarchy written not only into society but into our very DNA. The age of god-kings had begun, and with it, a world where the victories of a few men became the destiny of millions. When kingdoms began to rise, power needed something stronger than fear to keep it standing. Swords could win battles, but they couldn't hold empires together. For that, rulers turned to something far older and deeper: belief. The first kings learned that if people saw their authority as sacred, they would obey without question. So they wrapped their power in rituals, oaths, and sacrifice, turning politics into religion and dominance into destiny. The earliest temples were not built just to honor the gods. They were built to honor the men who claimed to speak for them. Priesthoods emerged as the spiritual branch of the same hierarchies that ruled the fields and armies. Priests recorded the harvest, blessed the weapons, and told the people that the ruler's command came straight from heaven. In Mesopotamia, kings called themselves shepherds, chosen by divine will. In Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a man, he was a living god, the bridge between mortals and eternity. These ideas didn't spread through reason. They spread through ritual, repeated until they felt like truth. Oaths became one of the most powerful tools of control. Men swore loyalty not only to their leaders, but to the gods those leaders represented. Breaking an oath wasn't just betrayal, it was blasphemy. Whole armies marched under divine promises, convinced they were fighting for cosmic order rather than conquest. This is how endless wars became sacred duties. Dying in battle could now mean eternal glory instead of meaningless death. In this way, religion turned conflict into purpose. Sacrifice made the system complete. When people gave offerings to the gods, they were really reinforcing the structure of obedience that held society together. In some cultures, it was grain or animals. In others, it was blood. Sacrifice reminded everyone that life and death were part of the same order, ruled by the same divine hierarchy that governed kings and soldiers alike. The ruler gave commands, the priest gave meaning, the people gave their lives. It was a perfect loop of power sanctified by ceremony. Even outside the temples, this pattern shaped daily life. Festivals celebrated the strength of rulers, linking the rhythm of seasons to the rule of dynasties. Priestly blessings made armies feel unstoppable. Every victory was proof of divine favor, every defeat a test of faith. Over time, these beliefs became systems so ingrained that questioning them felt like questioning the world itself. What had once been brute strength became moral truth. The kings no longer needed to fight for their thrones. They could simply claim to be chosen. The rituals kept the illusion alive. The gods were watching, the oaths were binding, and the sacrifices would keep the heavens in balance. In truth, it wasn't balance that the rituals preserved. It was control. The priest and the king ruled side by side, feeding each other's power, ensuring that every man born into their world would believe his purpose was to serve, to fight, and to die for something higher than himself. When scientists trace the great waves of migration that shaped the modern world, they keep finding the same hidden pattern beneath the surface. Every time a new language family spreads across continents, a single male lineage seems to spread with it. The rise of new cultures, new technologies, and even new words often rides on the back of conquest. Some of the most dramatic expansions in human history were not just about people moving. They were about specific Y chromosomes traveling farther and faster than ever before. One of the clearest examples began on the Eurasian steppe around 5,000 years ago. There, a people known as the Yamnaya mastered the horse. With wagons, herds, and weapons of bronze, they turned the endless grasslands into highways of migration. Within a few centuries, they spread west into Europe and east into Central Asia, carrying with them what would become the Indo-European languages. Alongside their words came their DNA. Nearly every modern European Y chromosome traces back to a handful of steppe ancestors from this period. Before them, Europe had been home to many local farming lineages. Afterward, only the steppe ones remained. Conquest and language moved together, reshaping the continent from the inside out. Far to the south, another wave of expansion was unfolding. In West Africa, the rise of agriculture and ironworking fueled the Bantu migrations. Starting around 3,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking farmers spread across the continent, bringing crops, livestock, and new social structures. Their movements replaced or absorbed countless smaller groups, reshaping the genetic map of sub-Saharan Africa. Once again, the Y chromosome tells the same story. A few dominant male lineages from the original Bantu homelands expanded across millions of square miles, while local male lines faded. The women's DNA, however, remained diverse, showing that the newcomers married into existing communities as they spread. Conquest and connection intertwined, repeating the same rhythm of dominance and absorption. Across the oceans, the pattern appeared again. The Austronesian expansion, beginning around 4,000 years ago, carried seafarers from Taiwan into the Pacific. They reached the Philippines, Indonesia, and eventually islands thousands of miles away, guided only by the stars and the wind. Archaeology shows their boats. Linguistics traces their words. Genetics reveals their legacy. A single Y chromosome lineage dominates the islands they settled, spreading as fast as their language. Once again, the women's lineages tell a story of blending, of local ancestry mixing with the newcomer's paternal heritage. Everywhere humanity moved, the same formula played out. Male-driven migration built on technology and social hierarchy, spreading new ways of life while pruning old lineages. Horses, canoes, and iron tools became the engines of genetic transformation. The languages spoken today across half the planet carry echoes of those ancient journeys. But beneath the words lies a quieter truth written in DNA. When people spread, it was rarely everyone who moved. It was a few men leading many families, carrying their bloodlines farther than any one tribe could imagine, leaving behind a world that now speaks their tongues and carries their chromosomes. For thousands of years, human history was written in bloodlines and broken lineages. Whole generations of men vanished in wars that never seemed to end. But at some point, the cycle began to slow. The world didn't suddenly become peaceful, but something changed deep in how people organized themselves. The systems that once rewarded endless killing began to reward survival instead. The first cracks in the old order came from necessity. As populations grew, the cost of war rose too high. Destroying a neighboring village no longer meant more land and resources. It meant less trade, fewer allies, and the risk of famine. People started realizing that cooperation could feed them better than conquest. The same intelligence that once built weapons began to build systems of peace. In Mesopotamia, the first written laws appeared. Hammurabi's code, carved into stone around the 18th century before the Common Era, didn't just regulate theft or property, it set limits on revenge. Justice was no longer personal, it belonged to society. If someone harmed another, the punishment was decided by rules, not blood. The idea was revolutionary. It stopped feuds from spiraling into clan wars that could erase entire lineages. Around the same time, trade began to knit distant regions together. Merchants crossed deserts and sailed rivers, carrying goods between cultures that had once been enemies. When your wealth depends on your neighbor's survival, war becomes bad for business. Trade routes made peace profitable. Gold, spices, and grain became more valuable than blood. The rise of cities added another layer of stability. When tens of thousands of people live behind the same walls, conflict must be managed, not unleashed. Armies still existed, but they were tools of defense and expansion, not total extermination. Empires learned to govern through administration, tribute, and diplomacy rather than constant slaughter. Even intermarriage became a political strategy. Royal families sealed alliances with weddings instead of battles. Blood that had once divided clans now united them. Every marriage between former enemies created a bridge that made future wars less likely. Over time, the same genetic forces that had once erased lineages began to preserve them. The male Y chromosome stopped shrinking as quickly. Diversity stabilized. The human population began to grow in both number and variety. Civilization had learned, through brutal trial and error, that survival didn't come from destruction, it came from balance. Religion played a role too. The same temples that once blessed wars began preaching harmony, compassion, and restraint. Whether through fear of divine punishment or genuine belief, the message worked. Slowly, the world began to prefer peace over annihilation. None of this ended violence completely. Wars continued, but they no longer wiped out entire lineages. The system that had once turned men into tools of genetic erasure evolved into one that valued their endurance. Humanity had learned that cooperation could outlast conquest. The killing didn't stop entirely, but for the first time in history, the future wasn't built on extinction. It was built on coexistence. Even though the ancient wars that nearly erased humanity's male lines ended thousands of years ago, their shadows still move quietly beneath modern life. The ways people love, marry, fight, and prove themselves all carry traces of those long centuries of inter-clan conflict. You can still see the genetic scars written in our bodies, but the cultural ones run even deeper. The obsession with honor, the exchange of dowries and bride wealth, the trials of manhood that mark boys as warriors or protectors, all come from a time when survival depended on defending your lineage at any cost. In early clan societies, a man's reputation wasn't just pride, it was protection. If others believed you could not be insulted without consequence, your family was safer. Losing face could mean losing land, livestock, or even life. That instinct to defend honor became a survival mechanism, passed down through generations until it hardened into culture. Even today, many communities still carry these codes, teaching sons to stand their ground, to never show weakness, to answer humiliation with action. These aren't random traditions. They are echoes of a world where reputation kept your bloodline alive. Marriage customs also bear the mark of those ancient systems. Dowries and bride wealth began as practical exchanges, compensation for the loss or gain of a family member in societies where alliances mattered more than love. When families traded daughters between clans, they weren't just forming bonds, they were redistributing power. Cattle, gold, or land changed hands to balance those connections, turning marriage into an economic treaty that could prevent or provoke war. The practice made sense in a world built on lineage survival. It still lingers now, long after its purpose has faded. Behind every negotiation over marriage, every social expectation of who owes what, lies the memory of that old economy of kinship and control. Male initiation rites trace the same lineage of meaning. Across continents, from Africa to Oceania, young men undergo rituals that test their courage and endurance. Whether it's scarification, isolation, or symbolic combat, these ceremonies are designed to transform boys into defenders of their people. In the past, they were literal training for survival, a preparation for the violence every man was expected to face. Passing those trials meant joining the circle of warriors who could protect the clan and carry its name. Today, many of those rituals have softened or become symbolic, but the psychology behind them remains. They are about proving worth through struggle, about earning identity through pain and loyalty. The world no longer demands that men die for their clans, yet the instinct to fight for belonging, to guard family and pride, still runs through our cultures and our genes. The wars that shaped humanity's ancestry may have ended, but the lessons they left behind still guide how people build families, form hierarchies, and define what it means to be strong. We carry the scars not as wounds, but as memories of what it once took for our ancestors to survive. Science is built on curiosity, but it also thrives on doubt. Every discovery about the ancient collapse of male lineages raises new questions. The story of the neolithic bottleneck sounds dramatic, almost too perfect, and that's why researchers keep testing it from every angle. Some believe the data clearly point to massive social conflict and hierarchical power. Others argue that what we see in DNA might be the result of quieter, slower processes that left similar patterns. The truth is, the deeper we dig, the more complex it becomes. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it's not perfect. Bones rot, sites are incomplete, and contamination can blur the lines between past and present. Every genome scientists extract is like a single puzzle piece from a picture that's mostly missing. When they model population sizes or compare haplogroups, they rely on assumptions that can shift with new evidence. That means every conclusion is temporary, a working theory waiting to be refined. For example, some geneticists argue that the Y chromosome bottleneck might not reflect global warfare, but regional collapses happening at different times. Others think social hierarchy and polygyny explain much of it without needing large-scale violence. Still others suggest disease, climate change, or migration could have worked together with social pressure to create the pattern. Each explanation fits part of the data, but none captures the whole picture. Archaeology adds another layer of uncertainty. Burned villages and mass graves tell stories of violence, but they don't reveal the exact cause. Was it war between clans or famine-driven chaos? Did new technologies like metal weapons tip the balance? Even the dating of artifacts can shift the timeline by centuries, enough to change how events connect. As new sites are uncovered, the old stories evolve. Advances in computing have also changed how scientists study the past. Early genetic models looked at small samples and short time spans. Now, powerful simulations can track thousands of generations, testing how even minor social differences ripple through centuries. Each time the models grow more sophisticated, they confirm that small biases, like elite men having more children, can reshape entire populations. But they also reveal how random chance and environmental shocks can amplify those effects. In recent years, new genomes from Africa, Siberia, and the Pacific have filled gaps that once seemed impossible to bridge. Each one adds another thread to the story, sometimes reinforcing the bottleneck theory, sometimes unraveling parts of it. That's how science moves forward, through argument and correction. The researchers studying these patterns don't claim to have final answers. They know the past is bigger than any single explanation. The war that nearly erased men might have been fought with swords, with sickness, or simply with time. The data will keep changing as technology improves. What will remain is the mystery that drives it, the desire to understand how close humanity once came to vanishing, and how, against all odds, we're still here to keep asking questions. When scientists first revealed that almost every male lineage on Earth had collapsed thousands of years ago, people couldn't help but look for modern parallels. History is full of moments where the balance between men and women has been thrown off by war, policy, or disaster. But comparing our age to that ancient bottleneck is tricky. The scale, the causes, and the world itself are different. Still, the echoes are there, faint but familiar. In the 20th century, 2 world wars killed tens of millions of men in just a few years. Entire towns in Europe lost nearly all their adult males. Afterward, women outnumbered men in many places, reshaping families and societies. The scars lasted for generations. In some regions, this even changed cultural expectations, as women took on work and leadership roles that had been closed to them before. But even that scale of loss, unimaginable in human terms, barely touched the diversity of the modern gene pool. The world was too big, the population too vast, for any one conflict to erase whole lineages the way ancient wars did. Yet the same logic that once governed survival still flickers in the modern age. Genocide, for instance, often targets men first. In conflicts from Rwanda to the Balkans, aggressors have deliberately killed male populations to break the strength of families and communities. The strategy is ancient. Remove the men, control the future. The women are spared or absorbed, their children carrying the DNA of the victors just as they did thousands of years ago. The pattern is not identical, but the instinct behind it is hauntingly similar. Even social policies can create echoes of the old imbalance. In China, during the late 20th century, the one-child policy, combined with cultural preference for sons, led to a generation where millions of girls were never born. The result was the opposite of the neolithic bottleneck, a society skewed toward men rather than women. And just like in ancient times, that imbalance brought consequences, from social tension to shifts in marriage and migration patterns. It's a reminder that whenever humanity tries to control reproduction, the effects ripple through generations. But the biggest difference between then and now is awareness. The people who lived through the bottleneck didn't know they were changing the course of evolution. Today, scientists can see those shifts as they happen and warn of their impact. Modern wars and policies may echo ancient instincts, but they no longer define humanity's survival. Technology, medicine, and communication have made our species more resilient to collapse. The genetic tree that was once pruned to near extinction now spreads wider than ever before. Still, the lesson remains. When power, violence, or control over reproduction concentrates in too few hands, the results can shape the future in ways no one intends. The Neolithic bottleneck is not repeating, but its shadow lingers, reminding us how fragile balance can be and how easily the story of humanity could once again narrow to the choices of a few. The night was silent at first, the kind of silence that only comes when the wind dies and the fires have burned low. In the small village, tucked between the river and the dark hills, families were sleeping, unaware that history was about to erase them. Dogs barked once, then twice, then fell quiet. Somewhere in the distance came the sound of hooves and feet on packed dirt, soft at first, then louder. The first man to wake was the elder. He had lived through droughts and floods, but never this. By the time he stepped outside, the raiders were already crossing the fields, torches in their hands, blades glinting in the firelight. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. The screams came soon enough. The attack lasted less than an hour. For the men of the village, there was no defense. They fought with stone tools and hunting spears against warriors who had trained since childhood, men who had killed before and would kill again. The defenders died quickly, most before they reached their weapons. The women and children hid in huts or fled toward the river, clutching one another in the darkness. When it was over, the huts burned. The raiders moved from house to house, taking food, animals, and anything that could be carried. Then they gathered the survivors, maybe 30 in all. The leader, a tall man with a bronze knife at his belt, gave a single command. The women and the smallest children would be taken. The rest, the boys old enough to remember their fathers, were left behind. At dawn, the smoke rose straight into the sky. By midday, nothing remained of the village but ashes, broken tools, and bodies. The raiders vanished into the hills, leading their captives away in silence. Days later, a group of survivors crept back. A few old men, wounded and half-starved, found the ruins of their homes. They buried what they could, marking the graves with stones and prayers. One of them, a boy of 12, would grow up to tell the story again and again. He would describe the faces, the smell of smoke, the way the stars had looked that night, bright and cold above the flames. To him it was just one tragedy, but to history it was one thread in a pattern that stretched across continents. That single night was part of the process that shaped the DNA of the modern world. A handful of men killed, their lines ended forever. A handful of women taken, their children becoming part of another people. No one in that moment could have known that thousands of years later, scientists would read their story in chromosomes, tracing the loss and survival written in blood. The numbers we talk about now, the percentages and lineages, were once lives like theirs. One village, one night, multiplied across centuries, until only the victors' sons remained to remember the world that war had built. The story of the bottleneck is not just about numbers or genes. It is about what it means to be human. Thousands of years ago, the world came close to losing almost every male lineage. The wars, the hierarchies, the cycles of conquest that shaped early civilization left scars so deep they can still be seen in our DNA, yet somehow humanity survived. The paradox is that the same instincts that nearly destroyed us also made us stronger. Cooperation, loyalty, courage, and ambition all evolved alongside violence and greed. They are two sides of the same story. The lesson of the bottleneck is that survival alone is not enough. The future depends on whether we can grow beyond the logic that created our past. For most of history, power was measured by control, by how many people you could command or how much land you could hold. That mindset built kingdoms, but it also built the systems that erased countless lives. The Y chromosome collapse reminds us how fragile our species once was, when it followed the path of dominance instead of balance. Every battle that wiped out a rival clan may have seemed like victory, but in the long view, it was humanity erasing itself. The men who survived weren't better, only luckier. Their sons inherited a world built on conquest, and that pattern repeated until it became tradition. Today, we live in the shadow of that inheritance. The urge to dominate, to divide, to define ourselves by competition still runs deep. We see it in politics, in economics, even in the way we talk about success. But the same story that once rewarded destruction also offers a warning. Evolution does not favor cruelty forever. It rewards adaptation. The systems that once ensured survival no longer fit the world we live in. Our ancestors fought because isolation was all they knew. We now live in a global society where cooperation is not just moral but necessary. Climate, technology, and population bind us together in ways the ancient clans could never imagine. The bottleneck teaches that every hierarchy eventually collapses under its own weight, and every cycle of dominance ends the same way, in loss. If the past nearly erased our fathers, then the future depends on remembering them not as warriors, but as warnings. The fact that we exist at all means humanity learned something from those silent centuries of blood and fire. Our strength now lies not in how we fight, but in how we connect, how we choose to share rather than conquer. The Y chromosome bottleneck is both tragedy and proof of endurance. It shows that even when humanity cuts itself down to the root, it can grow again. But if we want that growth to last, we must break the pattern that once almost ended us. The lesson written in our DNA is clear. The war that killed nearly every man on Earth must never be fought again, not with weapons, not with ideas, not with each other.